The morning Harriet Holloway rode into Caldwell, Kansas, with nothing but a worn leather saddlebag, a loaded Winchester, and a determination that could have cut glass. She was not looking for love, she was looking for work, and she had already decided that love was a luxury she could no longer afford. It was the spring of 1878, and the plains of southern Kansas had awakened from a brutal winter that had frozen the Arkansas River solid and killed half the cattle in the county. The town of Caldwell itself was a rough seam stitched between the wilderness and civilization, a cattle town that sat right on the Kishom Trail, where drovers came through with their longhorns, their trail dust, their whiskey money, and their restlessness. It was not a gentle place, and Harriet Holloway was not a gentle woman, though she was a good one, which was an altogether different thing. She rode a dun-colored mare named Pepper who had one white ear and a bad habit of biting men she did not like. And as Harriet pulled up in front of the Caldwell land office, she swung down from the saddle with the practiced ease of someone who had spent most of her 26 years in the saddle. She tied Pepper to the post, patted the mare's neck once, and walked inside. The land agent, a portly man named Dewey Fitch who smelled of pipe tobacco and nervous sweat, looked up at her from behind a desk cluttered with survey maps and deed papers. He clearly had not been expecting a woman to walk through his door that morning. "I am looking for work," Harriet said, before he could get his mouth open to say whatever foolish thing he had been preparing. "Field work. I can plow, plant, harvest, mend fence, manage livestock, and I ride better than most men you have in this county. I need wages, nothing more and nothing less, and I need to know who in this county is hiring." Dewey Fitch blinked at her twice. He took in her practical clothing, a canvas work jacket, denim trousers that were unusual for a woman but clearly functional, boots that had seen hard miles, and the way she held herself, straight and unapologetic, and he seemed to make some internal calculation. "Clarence Vaughn," he said finally, "out on the Sweetwater Creek spread about 7 miles northeast. Lost 2 of his ranch hands to the Dodge City Trail drives last month, and his third man broke his leg in a riding accident 2 weeks ago. Man is behind on his spring planting, and he has a wheat crop that needs to go in the ground before the rains stop. He has been in here twice this week asking about hands." "How do I find it?" Harriet asked. Fitch drew her a rough map on a scrap of paper, and she was back on Pepper and riding northeast before the morning had gotten much older. The land she rode through was the kind of landscape that got inside a person whether they wanted it to or not. The Kansas plains in spring had a particular beauty that was not the soft, hedged-in beauty of the East, but something rower and bigger, a beauty that made a person feel both very small and very alive at the same time. The sky ran from horizon to horizon without interruption, a dome of pale blue that deepened overhead, and the prairie grass was coming up green and new after the snow melt, rippling in the south wind like the surface of an inland sea. Red-winged blackbirds called from the cattails along the creek bottoms, and somewhere out on the open plain, a meadowlark was sending its liquid song up into the morning, as though it had something important to say, and all the sky to say it in. Harriet had grown up in Missouri, on a farm outside of Independence, the eldest of 5 children of a father who had believed firmly that there was no work too heavy for any person willing to put their back into it, regardless of whether they happened to be male or female. He had been a practical man, her father, and a fair one, and he had taught her to plow and plant and harvest right alongside her brothers, and to ride and shoot because the land demanded it. Her mother had died when Harriet was 15, and she had stepped into that gap without complaint, raising her younger siblings and running the farm and growing into a woman who knew exactly what she was capable of. She had been married once briefly. His name had been Thomas Holloway, a farmer from a neighboring county, and she had liked him well enough and had thought she might come to love him with time. But Thomas had been taken by a fever in the winter of 1875, just 8 months after their wedding, before there had been time for children or for the deeper roots of love to grow. She had kept his name because it was hers now, and she had sold the farm because the debt on it was too heavy for one person to carry, and she had been moving west and east and around the edges of things ever since, working where she could find work, saving what she could save, looking for the particular piece of land and life that felt like it belonged to her. She had almost enough money now for a land claim of her own. Almost. She needed one more good season of wages, and then she would have enough to file under the Homestead Act, enough to buy the seed and the basic equipment, enough to start. She was not sentimental about the means by which she got there. She needed work, she was willing to do it, and she intended to keep things strictly professional and practical and uncomplicated, because she did not have the time or the energy for anything else. That was the frame of mind she was in when she rode through the gate of the Sweetwater Creek Ranch and got her first look at Clarence Vaughn. He was in the near pasture, working a young sorrel horse on a long line, and he was so focused on what he was doing that he did not hear her ride up to the fence. He was a tall man, lean but broad through the shoulders, somewhere in his early 30s, with dark hair that curled slightly at the back of his neck where his hat did not cover it. He wore a collarless shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and canvas work pants tucked into worn boots, and he moved with a quiet, deliberate economy of motion that told her immediately he was someone who knew what he was doing and did not need to make a show of it. The sorrel was nervous, circling tight and fast, tossing its head, and Clarence just kept his voice low and steady and the line easy in his hands, turning with the horse, not fighting it, just being a calm center that the animal could eventually find its way back to. After another minute or so, the sorrel slowed, blew out a long breath through its nostrils, and came to a stop with its head lowered. Clarence walked toward it slowly, hand extended, and put his palm against the horse's neck, and the animal stood quiet. Then he looked up and saw Harriet sitting on Pepper at the fence, and she had the distinct impression that he was as good at reading people as he was at reading horses, because he studied her for just a moment with a pair of clear gray eyes, and whatever he read seemed to satisfy some question he had been asking before he looked away. He walked the sorrel to a post, tied it, and came over to the fence. Up close he was older than she had first thought, probably 32 or 33, with the kind of face that weathering and outdoor work gave a man, the lines around his eyes from squinting against sun and wind, the jaw that was not quite cleanly shaved but not quite bearded either. There was nothing flashy about him. He was just solid and present and real in the way that the land around him was real. "You are Clarence Vaughn," Harriet said. It was not a question. "I am," he said. "And you are not from around here." "Dewey Fitch at the land office sent me," she said. "My name is Harriet Holloway. I am told you are looking for ranch hands." He looked at her steadily, not with the dismissive skepticism she had half expected, but with what seemed like genuine assessment. "I am," he said. "What can you do?" she told him. She told him everything she had told Fitch, and added to it. She had worked 2 harvests in Nebraska, a cattle drive season in the Indian Territory helping manage the remuda, had put in a full spring planting on a wheat farm outside of Wichita the previous year. She could handle a team, she could work a planter, she knew when wheat was ready and how to tell it from a distance by the color, and she was not afraid of hard work or long days. He listened to all of it without interruption. When she was finished, there was a brief silence, and a meadowlark called somewhere out in the grass behind him. "What are your terms?" he asked. "Wages only," she said. "Standard ranch hand pay. I will work the spring planting, the summer, and the harvest if you need me that long. I will do the work you need done, and I will do it well. But I want it understood from the beginning that this is a wage arrangement, nothing more. I am saving for a land claim of my own, and I intend to keep things simple and professional." He seemed to consider this. He pushed his hat back slightly on his head and looked out across his land, the greening fields, the creek line of cottonwoods to the north, the neat unpainted barn, and the house with its porch facing south toward the road, and then he looked back at her. I have got 40 acres of winter wheat that should have already been replanted in the low field where the frost heaved it. Another 60 that needs to go in from scratch. A kitchen garden that is 2 weeks behind. 3 miles of fence that needs mending before I can rotate my cattle. And a barn roof that has developed opinions about whether it wants to stay attached to the barn, he said. My regular men are gone, and I am behind in ways that are going to cost me the year if I do not catch up quickly. I can offer you $1 a day and you're bored. $1 a day was fair. It was what a competent male hand earned in that territory, and the fact that he had offered it without negotiation told her something about his character. Agreed, she said. He extended his hand over the fence rail, and she leaned down from the saddle and shook it. His grip was firm and brief and businesslike, and that was exactly what she had wanted it to be. You can put your horse in the south pasture, he said. The bunkhouse is behind the barn, east side. There is nobody else in it right now, so you will have it to yourself, which I expect is better for both our reputations than the alternative would be. She appreciated that he had thought about it practically and said so plainly. She rode Pepper around to the south pasture gate without another word, and that was how the working arrangement between Harriet Holloway and Clarence Vaughn began. The bunkhouse was a plain rectangular building with 4 bunks, a wood stove, a rough table with 2 chairs, and a row of iron hooks along one wall for gear. It was clean, which surprised her and then did not, because the rest of the property had the same quality, not fancy, not new, but maintained with care, as though the person living there had a fundamental respect for things that worked and wanted to keep them working. She unpacked her saddlebag, which did not take long, since everything she owned was in it, made up the nearest bunk with the wool blanket she had rolled behind her saddle, and went to find Clarence to start work. He was at the barn, sharpening plowshares, and he handed her a file and a second share without comment, and they worked side by side in the early afternoon quiet, the rasp of iron on iron the only sound between them, while the horses moved in the pasture outside, and a pair of swallows built something in the barn's upper beams with the focused industry of creatures who have no time to waste. By the end of her first week on the Sweetwater Creek Ranch, Harriet had replanted the heaved wheat field, started the kitchen garden, and mended a full 1.5 miles of the fence line along the north pasture. She worked from first light until the light failed, ate at the table in the ranch house kitchen where Clarence set a place for her without making a production of it, and slept hard in the bunkhouse without dreaming. She noticed, in the precise and cataloging way she noticed most things, that Clarence Vaughn was not like the other men she had worked for or alongside. He did not treat her with the anxious over-helpfulness of men who were not sure how to behave around a working woman, and he did not treat her with condescension or suspicion, and he did not make comments that she had to decide whether to let pass or address. He treated her the way he treated anyone doing competent work, which was with a level, matter-of-fact respect that she found unexpectedly restful. He corrected her once early on, about the depth she was setting the furrows for the wheat, and he was right, and she said so, and he nodded and moved on, and that was that. What she noticed second was that he was a man who had clearly been alone for a long time, and had organized his life around that aloneness in a way that was functional but had left certain things untended. Not his land, which was well cared for, but something interior, something that showed in the quietness of the house, and the absence of small, comfortable objects that people acquired when they expected to share their lives with someone. The kitchen had everything necessary and nothing else. The parlor had a chair and a writing desk and a shelf of books, which surprised her pleasantly, and no rug on the floor and no curtains on the windows and no photographs or pictures on the walls. It was a house that had been built for a family and was being maintained by a solitary person who had decided not to pretend otherwise. He had been married once too. She learned from a neighbor woman named Bessie Crane who came by in the second week with a basket of early spring preserves and the kind of sociable curiosity that small communities bred naturally. Clarence's wife, a woman named Ada, had died 3 years earlier in childbirth, along with the baby, and he had been running the ranch alone since then. Bessie said it with the quiet sorrow of someone who had known Ada and missed her, and Harriet listened and filed it away and did not ask further questions because it was not her business. But she thought about it. She thought about what it would be to build something with a person and then lose them and their child in a single night. And she looked at the ranch around her with slightly different eyes after that. The care he put into maintaining it, the early mornings and the late evenings, the way he sometimes stood at the edge of the south field in the evening as though looking at it from a slight distance helped him see it better, and she understood those things differently. She caught herself noticing more than she had intended to notice, and she caught herself doing it with a regularity that she found inconvenient. The spring rains came in the 3rd week of April, fat and generous, turning the newly planted fields dark and fragrant, and filling the creek beyond its usual bounds, until it ran amber and fast between the cottonwoods. The work shifted to the barn and the outbuildings when the fields were too wet, and that was when Harriet got up on the barn roof with a hammer and a bucket of nails, and addressed its opinions about whether it wanted to remain attached. She had been up there about an hour, working along the ridge from the east end where 3 courses of shingles had lifted and split, when she became aware that she had an audience. She looked down from where she was crouched along the ridge line and found Clarence standing below in the rain without his hat, looking up at her with an expression she could not quite read. "I was planning to do that myself," he said. "I know," she said. "But I am faster on a roof than most people, and you have the fence to finish on the south line before the cattle get through it. You said so this morning." He was quiet for a moment. The rain came down steadily between them. "Can you see the problem from up there?" he asked, and his voice had shifted into the purely practical register she had come to recognize as meaning he was setting aside whatever other thought he had been having. "3 sections need replacing on the east pitch," she called down. "The west ridge looks sound. The flashing around the chimney has pulled away on the north side and will need to be reset, or you will have water inside the barn come summer." "Do you need anything?" he asked. "Another bucket of nails and about 10 more shingles," she said. He brought them without further comment, handed them up to her from the top of the ladder he had fetched from inside, and then he stood in the rain for just a moment longer than was necessary before he pulled his hat back on and went to deal with the south fence. She was most of the way done with the roof when she heard a sound below her that made her pause. She looked down and saw him returning from the south fence line, and he had stopped beside the barn wall not because he was checking on her, she thought, but because he was just tired and wet and leaning against the wall for a moment with his eyes closed, and his face turned up into the rain in a way that was very private and very unguarded, and she looked away immediately because it felt like seeing something she had not been meant to see. But she had seen it. And she thought about it later in the bunkhouse, lying awake while the rain drummed on the roof she had just fixed, listening to the sound of it and feeling, very quietly and against her better judgment, something begin to shift in her chest. The thing about living and working alongside someone was that it was not abstract. It was the daily reality of them, the specific weight of their presence, the sound of their voice in the morning and at the end of the day, the small, reliable things that a person did consistently until they became as recognizable as a signature. Harriet had been telling herself for years that she was not interested in another arrangement of that kind, that she had laid out a plan for herself that did not include it, that she knew exactly what she wanted, and love was not on the list. She had not reckoned on the particular problem of Clarence Vaughn, which was that he was not trying to be anything. He was just exactly himself, plainly and consistently, without performance or pretension, and there was something about that quality that wore away at her careful defenses the way water wore away stone, not all at once, but steadily, and not through force but through simple persistence. In May, a group of drovers came through Caldwell with a herd of Texas longhorns bound for the railhead, and 3 of them rode out to the Sweetwater Creek Ranch looking for work for the weeks between drives. Clarence hired 2 of them, a young man named Will Ferris who was 19 and enthusiastic and not entirely competent, and a quieter, steadier man named Joseph Cray, who was perhaps 40 and had been working cattle since he was old enough to hold a rope, and the dynamic of the ranch changed with more people on it. Will Ferris took one look at Harriet and clearly did not know what to make of her, but within a day of working alongside her, he had shifted into a younger brother kind of relationship, which she found endearing and which amused Joseph Cray, who had seen enough of life to find most things more interesting than alarming. Joseph was a black man who had been working the Texas cattle trails for 20 years, and he was one of the thousands of black cowboys who worked the drives during that era, skilled, experienced, and treated variably depending entirely on the individual he encountered. Clarence treated him with the same straightforward respect he gave everyone, which Harriet noted and was glad of. The 5 of them, Harriet, Clarence, Will, Joseph, and occasionally a neighboring farmer named Pete Lindquist who came to help with the heavy planting work in exchange for Clarence's help with his own fields later in the season, worked through May with the kind of focused, collective labor that was one of the genuine pleasures of that life, hard as it was. The wheat went in on schedule. The kitchen garden produced its first spring greens. The cattle were rotated to the fresh pastures as the fence line was completed, and the sorrel horse that Clarence had been working when Harriet first arrived began to look and move like a proper ranch horse under his continued patient attention. It was on an evening in late May, when the work had reached one of those natural pauses that hard labor occasionally allows, that Harriet and Clarence found themselves sitting on the porch steps in the cooling evening after supper, Will and Joseph having gone to the bunkhouse, and the whole wide sky turning colors over the prairie that no painter had ever quite gotten right. Orange and rose, and a particular deep gold that faded toward the zenith into a blue so deep it was nearly purple, and the first star appearing in the east while the last light still held in the west, and the creek running softly in the cottonwoods, and the cattle moving quietly in the pasture, and the meadowlark calling one last time before dark. "Your wheat is going to be a good crop," Harriet said, because she had been looking at the fields and thinking it. "Our wheat," he said, and then seemed to consider what he had said, and she could feel him decide not to qualify it. She looked at him sideways. He was looking out at the fields with the particular expression he wore when he was thinking about something else while looking at something in front of him. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask," he said. "Why do you stay here, on your own, I mean? Most ranchers this size take a partner or sell to someone with more capital. You could have a bigger operation if you pooled resources." He was quiet for a moment. A nighthawk went over, its call cutting the darkening air. "I built this place," he said. "Every fence post and furrow. I know where every spring is and which low spots flood in April and how the wind comes through this particular draw in winter. I am not interested in giving any of that away." He paused. "Are you asking because you are deciding whether to stay through the harvest?" "I said I would stay through the harvest," she said, slightly sharply, because the suggestion that she might go back on a commitment irritated her. "I know you did," he said mildly. "I just wondered whether there was something else behind the question." There was something else behind the question, but she was not ready to look at it directly yet, so she said nothing. And after a moment he said nothing either, and they sat in the quiet together as the stars came out one by one until the sky was full of them, and the crickets started in the grass, and eventually she said good night and went to the bunkhouse. She lay on her bunk and looked at the ceiling and thought about what she was doing. She had come here with a clear plan. She was going to work this man's land for wages, save the last of what she needed, file her homestead claim, and build her own life in the clear, uncomplicated way she had been building toward for 3 years. That was still what she wanted. That was still the plan. The problem was that somewhere in the weeks of working alongside him, of watching him handle his horses with patience and his workers with fairness and his land with love, She had started wanting something else too, something she had been telling herself she did not want, and the two things were sitting in her chest together like two neighboring flames that were starting to become one fire, and she did not know yet what to do about that. June came in hot and dry, the kind of dry that made ranchers watch the sky with a particular attention, and Harriet threw herself into the work with extra intensity, which was something she did when she was thinking about something she did not want to think about. She was up before everyone else and out in the fields, and she pushed herself through the work methodically and hard, and at the end of the days she was tired enough that the thoughts were quieter. Clarence noticed. He noticed in the same careful, unhurried way he noticed everything, and one evening after supper when Will and Joseph had gone to the creek to fish and the ranch was quiet, he came to where she was mending a harness outside the barn and sat down on the bench across from her. "You are working too hard," he said. "You hired me to work hard," she said, not looking up from the harness. "There is working hard and there is working like something is chasing you," he said. "I have seen both." She looked up then, because the observation was too accurate to dismiss. He met her eyes without evasion, and she thought that this was perhaps the most inconvenient thing about him, that he was perceptive without using it as a weapon. "I am fine," she said. "I know you are fine," he said. "You are also one of the best workers I have ever had on this property, and I do not want you breaking yourself before the harvest because you are trying to outrun something in your head." She set the harness down in her lap. "And if I told you there was nothing in my head, I would say that you are a more honest person than that," he said, not unkindly. They looked at each other across the barnyard, and the afternoon light came at a long angle through the dust that hung golden in the air between them, and she thought that if she had been someone else, or if the situation had been different, or if she had not made herself so many promises about keeping things simple, she would have said something quite different from what she said, which was, "I made an arrangement with you. Wages only. I think it is better for both of us if I stick to it." He looked at her for a long moment, and something moved through his expression that she could not name. Then he nodded, once, the way he did when he was accepting something he was not entirely sure he agreed with, and he got up from the bench and went back to the house, and she picked up the harness and went back to her mending, and that was the closest they came, in June, to saying the thing that was sitting between them like a stone in a stream. July brought the full weight of Kansas summer, the heat that rose off the fields in visible waves, the sky white-hot at noon, the work pace shifting to early mornings and evenings with a midday rest that the heat made necessary. The wheat was standing beautiful and tall, heading out in long golden beards that moved in the south wind, and on mornings before the sun was fully up, when the light was still amber and low, the fields had a quality that Harriet could not look at without feeling something move in her that was not about wheat at all. It was in July that she found out about Clarence's situation with the bank. She had not been looking for the information. She had gone to Caldwell to pick up a supply order that had come in on the freight wagon: flour, salt, a new set of harness rings they had been waiting on, and she stopped at the dry goods store, and behind her in the line was a man named Abe Strickland who owned the other large wheat operation in the county and who had a reputation, she had gathered from various conversations, for being the kind of man who believed that other people's difficulty was his opportunity. Strickland was talking to the store owner, not loudly but not quietly either, with the comfortable confidence of a man who thought himself safe from consequences. He was saying that Vaughn's note to the Caldwell Savings Bank was coming due in September, and that Vaughn had already extended it once, and that the summer had been dry enough that even a good harvest might not cover it, and that he intended to be at the land office in October with an offer for the east sections. Harriet bought her supplies and rode back to the ranch and said nothing to Clarence about what she had heard, but she spent the 7 miles back thinking about it very carefully. She did not bring it up directly, but that evening she found a reason to mention to Clarence over supper that she had run into Pete Lindquist in town and he had been talking about the harvest schedule, and she worked the conversation around until she said, as matter-of-factly as she could manage, Are you expecting a good return this year? The wheat looks strong, but I know the dry stretch cost you some in the low field." He looked at her with that clear-eyed steadiness. "It has been a tight year," he said. "It will come out all right." She wanted to say more, but she had told him it was wages only and nothing else, and she could not quite make herself step across the line she had drawn. She left it where it was and went to bed and lay awake for a while staring at the ceiling. 2 days later, coming back from the north pasture, she found Clarence sitting at his desk in the parlor with a row of figures in front of him, and an expression on his face that was very controlled in the way that people controlled their expressions when the numbers they were looking at were saying something they did not like. He heard her come in and he straightened the papers and looked up, and the controlled expression became a more ordinary one. "The north pasture fence is holding well," she said. "Good," he said. She stood in the doorway of the parlor for a moment, and then she said, "I am not going to pretend I do not know that you have a bank note coming due in September." He looked at her steadily and said nothing. "I heard Strickland talking in town," she said. "He has intentions about your east sections." A muscle moved in his jaw. "That is my concern," he said. "I know it is," she said. "I am not trying to make it mine. I just wanted you to know that I heard it. And I wanted you to know that if there is anything in how we are working the harvest that would help your margins, I will defer any judgment about the best way to do it to you." He looked at her for a long moment, and she thought she saw something shift in him, something that was not quite gratitude and not quite vulnerability, but lived in the country between those two things. "Thank you," he said, and he meant it in a way that went slightly beyond the practical. And she heard that, and she went to the kitchen and started the evening fire for supper, and thought that she had been wrong earlier in the season when she had thought it would be easy to keep things simple. The wheat harvest began on a bright Tuesday morning in August, with a sky so blue and clear it seemed almost theatrical, the kind of day that was made to remember. Joseph Cray had brought in 2 of his trail-driving friends to help with the cutting for a share of the labor exchange. Men named Dell and Marcus, who were experienced field hands, and Pete Lindqvist came with his own team, and they started at first light with scythes moving in the steady rhythm that turned standing grain into ordered rows, and the smell of cut wheat rose up in the heat like the smell of bread and summer and hard work mixed together. Harriet worked the binder, driving the 2-horse team up and down the rows, while the machine gathered and tied the bundles in its mechanical way, and the men followed behind, setting the bundles into shocks. The first day they cut 12 acres, and at the end of it they sat together in the long evening shadow of the barn and drank cold water from the well, and ate the supper she had prepared at noon and kept warm, and there was a deep satisfied feeling in the group that came from a day of serious work done well. Clarence moved through that day like a man in his element. He was everywhere, checking the binder, helping set shocks, cutting alongside the men when they needed pace set, and in all of it there was a quality she had been watching grow in him across the season, a particular aliveness that the harvest seemed to bring out. He laughed at something Dell said about a mule that had once sat down in the middle of a field and refused to move for 2 hours, a full genuine laugh that changed his face completely, and she was watching from 50 yards away with her hat pulled low against the afternoon sun, and she thought, in the plainest and most unguarded way, that she was in serious trouble. She had been in serious trouble for a while, if she was honest, which she was becoming increasingly unable to avoid being. The harvest took 10 days in total, and on the last day, when the final field was cut and shocked, and the work crew had been paid and had gone their various ways, leaving just Harriet and Clarence, and while standing in the stubble field in the long evening light with the whole gathered harvest around them, Clarence looked out across his land with an expression that she recognized as one she had seen before but never quite named. It was the expression of a person who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has just, for one moment, been allowed to put it down. Will, who had the young man's excellent instinct for when he was not needed, announced that he was going to see if there was anything left of supper in the kitchen and disappeared toward the house, and then it was just the two of them, and the evening and the cut fields and the sound of the creek and the first crickets starting up in the grass along the field edge. "Good harvest," Harriet said. "Better than I expected," he said. "The low field surprised me. The late rain helped it." She nodded. The sun was low and heavy, painting the stubble gold and the sky above the western horizon deep orange shading into rose. "It will cover the note," he said, not looking at her. "The harvest. It will cover it." "I am glad," she said, and she was, with a genuineness that had nothing to do with her wages and everything to do with the fact that she had spent a season watching this man hold his land together with skill and patience and care. And the idea of Strickland at the land office in October with his opportunistic offer had been sitting in her stomach like a cold stone for weeks. "I am going to need new hands for next spring," he said. It was still not quite looking at her, which was unusual for him. "Will is heading back to the trail drives. Joseph may come back, I think, but I will need others." "I expect you will find them," she said. "Will you be one of them?" He asked, and now he looked at her, and there was nothing indirect about it. She had known this moment was coming. She had been walking toward it since sometime in May, when the flames that were burning separately in her chest had decided to become one fire regardless of what she intended, and she had been telling herself all summer that, when it came, she would handle it calmly and practically, and she would say what she had always said. "Wages only, nothing more. I have a plan. I am sticking to it." "I have almost enough for my homestead claim," she said. "I know," he said. "You told me in the spring. I have not forgotten." "I have always meant to file for my own land," she said. "I know that too," he said. "What are you actually asking me?" she said, because the conversation had arrived at a place where the indirect language was not covering what was actually being said. He was quiet for a moment. The evening light moved across his face, and she thought that he was one of those rare people who were as honest with their silences as with their words, and that the silence was telling her something she had already known. "I am asking whether you might consider a different arrangement," he said. "Not wages only." She looked at him. He looked back at her, and in the clear gray of his eyes she could see that he was not asking lightly, that he had been thinking about this for as long as she had, possibly longer, and that whatever answer she gave would mean something real. "What kind of arrangement?" she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. "The kind where the land is ours," he said. "Not mine and yours, ours." The word fell into the evening air and sat there, as solid and real as the fields around them. She had been so careful. She had drawn the line so clearly, from the very beginning, wages only, professional and practical and uncomplicated. And she had held to it through 6 months of daily proximity and growing feeling, through the roof repairs and the harvest and the evenings on the porch and the conversations that walked right up to the edge of something and then stepped back. She had held to it because she had believed it was what she wanted, because she had believed that simplicity and independence were the same thing, and that love was a risk she could not afford. What she understood now, standing in the stubble of a harvested wheat field in the last light of an August evening, was that she had been wrong about several of those things. Independence was not the same as aloneness. Having a plan was not the same as knowing what you wanted. And some risks, she had learned over 6 months of watching Clarence Vaughn work his land with his whole self, were not risks at all but the most obvious and natural extensions of what you were already doing. "That is a large offer," she said. "I know," he said. "I would not make it if I did not mean it completely." She looked at the land around her, the stubble fields, the pastures, the creek line of cottonwoods, the house with its empty parlor and its bare windows, and she thought about the homestead claim she had been saving for, the piece of land she had imagined in the abstract, and she thought about what this land felt like, which was not abstract at all. It felt like hers. It had felt like hers since the first week, in the way that she had tended it, not like an employee doing a job, but like someone who cared what happened to it. She had not admitted that to herself, but she had known it. "I am not a woman who does things halfway," she said. "If I say yes to what you are asking, I will be a full partner in this, in the land, in the work, in the decisions. not a wife who sits in the house while her husband farms. I know exactly who you are, he said. I have been watching you work my fields for 6 months. I would not want the other kind. She was quiet for one more long moment. The last light was going, and the first stars were appearing at the edge of the darkening sky, and the creek ran in the cottonwoods, and somewhere in the near pasture a horse blew out a long, slow breath into the evening. "Then yes," she said. He did not say anything immediately, and she thought that was right, that the moment was too full for immediate words. Then he stepped toward her, not fast, the way he did everything with intention and without hurry, and she stayed where she was because she had stopped going anywhere, and when he reached her, he put one hand against the side of her face, and she covered it with her own hand, and the evening settled around them like something being completed. They were married in the first week of September, in the parlor of the Sweetwater Creek house, with Bessie Crane and her husband as witnesses, and the local reverend who came out from Caldwell on a Thursday afternoon. Will Ferris, who had delayed his departure to the trail drives by a week because he had somehow found out about the wedding, sat in the back corner of the parlor with his hat in his hands and cried with uncomplicated sentiment. Joseph Cray, who had come back to help with the thrashing and had stayed for reasons he described as personal convenience, stood in the kitchen doorway and was dignified about it. Harriet wore the best dress she owned, which was a deep blue cotton she had bought in Caldwell the week before, and she put flowers she had cut from the kitchen garden in her hair because Bessie Crane had looked so hopeful about it. And when the Reverend asked if she took this man, she said yes, with a directness that made the Reverend smile and Clarence look at her, in a way that she filed away in the private catalogue. She was building of his expressions. He had, in the 2 days before the ceremony, taken the furniture from the storage room where he had put it after Ada died and returned it to the parlor. A good braided rug, a pair of proper chairs, curtains that someone had made from a red print fabric. Harriet had come into the parlor and found it changed, and he had been watching for her reaction from the kitchen doorway, and she had turned and looked at him, and he had said quietly, "It is a house that was built for a family," and she had understood everything that was compressed into that sentence. After the wedding, which was modest and honest and good, they sat on the porch with the small group of friends until the evening cooled and the stars came out, and Bessie Crane had brought a cake from town, and Joseph Cray had produced a harmonica from somewhere, and played it with an ease that made Will Ferris dance badly in the yard to everyone's loud entertainment. At some point in the middle of it, Harriet looked at Clarence sitting beside her, watching his people with that quiet aliveness on his face, and she thought about the woman who had ridden into this county in the spring with a saddlebag and a Winchester, and a plan that had not included any of this, and she felt a deep, warm, uncomplicated gratitude for the gap between what she had planned and what had actually happened. The bank note was paid in full at the Caldwell Savings Bank on the 15th of September, and Clarence came home from that errand with a look of such quiet relief that she hugged him in the barnyard without thinking about it, and he held on for a moment longer than was strictly necessary before stepping back and saying that they needed to start thinking about the fall plowing. Abe Strickland came by the ranch in October, as Harriet had half expected he might, riding up to the gate with 2 of his men and a studied casualness that did not quite cover the calculation underneath it. He asked to speak to Vaughn about the east sections. Harriet was the one who met him at the gate. She had seen him coming from the kitchen window where she was putting up the last of the garden tomatoes, and she had dried her hands and walked out to the fence, and stood there with the same self-possessed directness she brought to all situations. Strickland looked at her with the same mild condescension she had encountered from men like him all her life, the kind that came from an unchallenged assumption about what women were relevant for, and he said that he was looking for Mr. Vaughn. "You are looking at Mrs. Vaughn," she said, "and we are not selling the east sections, Mr. Strickland, or any other sections. The note is paid, the land is clear, and the ranch is doing well. Have a good day." Strickland looked at her for a moment with an expression of recalibration that she found satisfying, and then he looked past her at Clarence, who had come out of the barn behind her, and was standing with his arms folded with a quality of stillness that communicated something definitive, and Strickland tipped his hat with a brevity that suggested he had received the message, and turned his horse. And that was the last time anyone from outside the ranch suggested anything about the east sections. The fall settled into the ranch like a long, slow exhale. The plowing went well. The winter wheat got in before the first hard freeze, and they spent evenings that were now different in quality from the summer evenings, warmer in the literal sense as the temperatures dropped, the wood stove in the parlor going in the evenings, the two of them on either side of it, Clarence reading from his shelf of books, which included a battered Shakespeare and 2 volumes of frontier history and a Bible that had been his mother's, and Harriet writing letters to her brother in Missouri and working through the account books with the systematic attention she brought to anything numerical. They talked. They talked in the evenings and in the mornings and on the long rides out to check the cattle and the fence lines, and she discovered that he had depths she had been catching glimpses of all summer, an intelligence that ranged widely, a curiosity about things he had not seen and history he had not lived through, a dry sense of humor that came out in small, unexpected ways that made her laugh out loud at moments she had not anticipated. He told her about growing up in Ohio, the son of a farmer who had come west in 1865 after the war on the theory that there was more future ahead than behind, and who had been right about that, and about how he had come to Kansas at 21 with a land claim and a determination to build something that was entirely his own, and the 10 years of work that had shaped Sweetwater Creek into what it was. He told her about Ada, carefully and honestly, because she had asked and because she was his wife, and because he was not a man who believed that the past was something to hide. He had loved Ada, and he carried that loss still, but he carried it the way you carried something that had changed you rather than something that was stopping you, and Harriet listened and understood and loved him for the honesty. She told him about Missouri and her family and her father, and about Thomas, whom she had married with good intentions and lost before she had known him well, and about the years in between, working and moving and saving toward a life that she was now living in a form she had not predicted, but that fit her more exactly than the one she had imagined. She told him that she had spent 6 months telling herself that the wages-only arrangement was what she wanted, and he laughed at that, a real laugh, that fully changed face laugh, and said that he had spent approximately the same 6 months telling himself something equally unconvincing. "What were you telling yourself?" she asked. "That a woman who had been that clear about her terms was not a woman who was going to change them," he said. "That I should appreciate having a good worker and stop wanting something else. And I was spectacularly unsuccessful at it," he said, which made her laugh, and she reached across the space between the chairs and took his hand, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat like that reading and writing in the firelight with the wind making its autumn sound around the house. The first snow fell on a Sunday in November, 2 inches of clean white that covered the fields and hung on the fence posts and turned the world outside the windows simple and quiet. They woke to it together and stood at the kitchen window with their coffee cups while the gray morning light showed them their land under its first winter dress, and the cattle standing dark in the pasture, and the cottonwoods along the creek gone skeletal and fine against the white ground. "This is better," Harriet said, not explaining what she meant by better or better than what, and Clarence said yes, with a certainty that told her he knew exactly what she meant. Well, Ferris came back from the trail drives in late November with a cracked rib he was downplaying and a new hat he was not, and stayed the winter helping with the cattle and eating Harriet's cooking with a gratitude that was almost comical and which she met by feeding him well and telling him his rib needed rest and not letting him lift anything heavy for 3 weeks, which he protested and she ignored. And by December he was sound again and had settled into the comfortable rhythm of the winter ranch routine. Joseph Cray came back in December too, having apparently decided that Sweetwater Creek had the qualities he was looking for in a permanent situation, and Clarence offered him a year-round position with a wage increase and use of the small stone building on the north edge of the property that had been a smokehouse and could be a proper room with some work. And Joseph took him up on it with the particular satisfaction of a man who has been moving for a long time and has found the place where he wants to stop moving. There was a quality to those winter months that Harriet had not expected and could not entirely name. It was not excitement or drama, none of the pitched intensity of the work-filled summer, but something quieter and more sustaining, the deep satisfaction of a life that was fully inhabited. She woke each morning to the reality of this land and this man and this particular existence, and she found it, day after day, to be more than enough. It was, in fact, precisely what she had been moving toward all along, even when she had not known it. She had given up the idea of the homestead claim with less difficulty than she would have expected. The land she had been saving for in the abstract was here in the specific, and it was more than she had been planning for: better soil, better water, better than she would have been able to afford on her own. She had spoken to a lawyer in Caldwell about ensuring that her name was on the deed alongside Clarence's, because she was a practical woman and believed in doing things properly, and Clarence had agreed immediately and gone with her to the land office to make it official, and that was that. The ranch was theirs in every legal and practical and emotional sense, equally. She wrote to her brother in Missouri that winter with a long letter that explained everything, and his reply came in February, full of the particular happiness of a brother who had been worrying about his sister and was relieved to find her settled, and asking when he might come to visit. She wrote back and said summer, when the planting was done, and there would be room to show him the land properly. The winter passed the way Kansas winters did, in alternating episodes of bitter cold and surprising mild stretches, with the cattle needing constant management, and the horses needing exercise, and the house needing the kind of maintenance that cold weather made visible. Clarence had started building an addition to the house in the late fall, a second bedroom and a storage room coming off the north wall, and on the days when the weather was mild enough he worked on it, and Harriet worked alongside him, because there was no version of this life she could imagine in which she would stand on the sidelines watching work be done. She learned things about him in those winter construction days that the summer had not shown her: the careful way he measured, twice always, and the pleasure he took in a joint fitting cleanly, and the mild inventive frustration when something did not go the way it was supposed to, which he expressed by going very quiet and looking at the problem from a slight distance until he solved it, the way he sometimes stood back from the fields. He learned things about her, too, that she could hold a measurement as steady as anyone he had worked with, and that she had opinions about structural decisions that were worth considering, and that when she was cold she got stubborn and did not admit it until her hands were visibly numb, which made him quietly bring her an extra pair of work gloves from the barn on the second occasion it happened. In March of 1879, when the land was waking up again, and the first green was beginning to show at the roots of the winter wheat, Harriet told Clarence that they were going to need the second bedroom sooner than they had planned. He looked at her, and she watched him understand what she was telling him, and the look that came across his face was the most open and unguarded thing she had ever seen from a man who was generally careful about his expressions. It was not a simple look. It had happiness in it, and something that looked like it might be the cautious side of hope, and something that was older and more complicated, the echo of a loss that was behind him but not forgotten. She crossed the space between them and put her hand against his face the way he had on that August evening in the harvested field, and he put his hand over hers, the same echo of that gesture, and she said quietly, "This one is going to be fine. We are both going to be fine." He nodded, and she felt him believe her or begin to. The spring planting of 1879 had Harriet working differently. She had told Clarence early that she intended to keep working, and he had accepted this without argument, though he watched her with a new attentiveness that was sometimes practical and sometimes just tender. And the ranch took on a new energy that spring, more people coming and going, more life in it. Her brother James came out from Missouri in May as planned, a big-shouldered man of 30 who looked at the ranch and then at his sister, and then at Clarence with the measuring eye of a man taking stock. And by the end of the first day, he had clearly decided that Clarence was acceptable, which announcement he made at the supper table with a directness that was recognizably the Holloway family trait, and which made Clarence laugh that full laugh, and which made Harriet tell her brother he was an idiot with a warmth that clearly meant the opposite. James stayed 2 weeks, helped with the planting, and rode back to Missouri with the air of a man whose outstanding business has been completed satisfactorily. Will Ferris, who had hero-worshipped him from the moment of meeting, was disappointed by his departure for approximately 2 days, and then cheered up because there was always something that needed doing. The summer of 1879 moved through the ranch in a rhythm that was both familiar and new familiar because it was the same land and the same work that had made up the previous year. New because everything was different in ways that had nothing to do with the tasks and everything to do with the life underneath them. Harriet worked through June and into July with the focused pleasure of someone whose work is entirely their own, not labor for someone else's wages, but the tending of a thing that was hers in every way that mattered. In late July, on a still hot night when the prairie hummed with the sound of summer insects and the sky was enormous with stars, their son was born. They named him Samuel, after Clarence's father, and he came into the world with the emphatic announcement that healthy babies made, and he was red-faced and very loud and had dark hair that stuck straight up, and Harriet looked at him in the lamplit bedroom with a feeling so large it had no edges, and Clarence sat beside her with his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands for a moment, just breathing. And then he looked up and looked at the two of them with something in his eyes that she had not seen there before and hoped to see there for the rest of her life. "He is fine," she said, for the second time, and Clarence nodded and reached out his hand and touched his son's tiny fist with one careful finger, and the fist closed around it with the instinctive strength that newborns had, and Clarence made a sound that was very quiet and not quite a word. Bessie Crane, who had come to help with the birth, left them to it with a kind smile and a practical list of instructions for the next 2 weeks, and they were alone, the three of them, in the lamplight while the Kansas night made its sounds outside the window and the new addition to the house, which Clarence had finished just in time, held them all properly under its roof. The harvest of 1879 was the best the ranch had produced since Clarence had planted the first crop on it 9 years earlier. The wheat came off even and heavy, and with Will and Joseph and 2 new hands, a pair of brothers named August and Carl Brandt, who had come down from Nebraska looking for steady work and found it, the cutting went faster than it ever had. Harriet managed the barn end of the operation and the household, and Samuel, who was by harvest time a round and curious 2-month-old, who spent his mornings in a basket in the shade, while his mother worked nearby, and seemed to find the whole arrangement satisfactory. She took him out to the edge of the east field on the last day of harvest, when the cutting was done, and the shocks stood in long golden rows in the late afternoon light, and she held him and looked at the land, and she thought about the woman who had ridden into this county a year and a half ago with a saddlebag and a plan and a very firm idea about what she did and did not want, and she felt something toward that woman that was not quite amusement and not quite compassion, but a mixture of both. The fond exasperation of understanding your past self. Clarence came across the field toward her, pulling off his hat and running his arm across his forehead, and he stopped beside her and looked at what she was looking at, the harvest, the land, the evening sky, and then he looked at Samuel, who had grabbed his father's sleeve with the focused interest that was becoming characteristic of him. "I want to expand the south field next year," Clarence said. "Break the sod on the last 20 acres and put it into wheat. It would mean we need to hire an extra hand through the planting season. I want to put in a proper kitchen garden on the east side," she said, "with a cold cellar underneath it. And I think we should talk to Pete Lindqvist about a shared thresher. Neither of us needs it full time, and the cost split between two operations makes sense." He looked at her. She looked at him. Samuel made an emphatic sound that might have been agreement. "You have been thinking about next year already," Clarence said. "I am always thinking about next year," she said. "It is how you make sure next year is better than this one." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him slightly, the way she had found herself doing without thinking about it this past year, the way that physical comfort settled into a life when you stopped being careful about it. And they stood in the stubble field in the last light of the harvest day with their son between them, and the whole of their land spread out to every horizon. "You came here for wages," he said, with that quiet thread of amusement that she had learned to listen for in his voice. "I did," she agreed, "and you made it very clear that was all you were interested in." "I was very clear about it," she said. "At what point did that change?" he asked. She thought about the roof in the rain, and the evenings on the porch, and the way he had looked when he was standing against the barn wall with his eyes closed, and his face turned up to the falling water, and the harvest field in August with the last light on it, and the word hours falling into the air and staying there. "I think it was always changing," she said. "I was just the last one to notice." He laughed, and she laughed too, and Samuel looked between them with the alert interest of a baby who understood that something good was happening even if he could not yet say what. They rode back to the house together in the gold of the evening, and the lights were on in the windows, and Will and Joseph and the Brant brothers were already at the table for supper, and the smell of the beef stew she had put on that morning came out through the door, and the whole ranch was alive with the good, warm sound of people at the end of a good hard day. The winter of 1879 and 1880 was a quiet and full one. Clarence finished a second round of improvements to the barn, and Harriet got her cold cellar dug and properly framed before the ground froze solid, and Samuel grew from a round and emphatic infant to a round and emphatic crawler who had a great deal to say about everything, and fell asleep each evening with the decisive completeness of someone who had been entirely present for the whole day. Harriet wrote to her brother James and told him about Samuel, which James already knew from a previous letter, but she was still moved to describe in detail. And James wrote back that he had been thinking about coming west properly, not just a visit but a move. And could she and Clarence tell him honestly whether the land in that part of Kansas was worth homesteading? She wrote back that it was, and gave him the honest assessment that included the hard winters and the dry summers and the bank complications, and also the soil quality and the water and the sky, and the quality of the community that was building itself in that country. And James came the following spring, and filed his own claim 8 miles north of Sweetwater Creek, and the country around it got a little smaller and a little more like home. The years settled into each other on the ranch in the way that good years did, not without difficulty, because the land and the weather did not make things easy. And 1881 was a dry year that cost them some of the wheat and made the cattle management harder. And there were seasons of debt and seasons of plenty and everything in between. But through all of it the ranch held together and grew, and the house that had been built for a family was won, and the parlor had its rug and its curtains and was gaining, year by year, the accumulated objects of a shared life: photographs on the wall, books added to the shelf, a pair of Samuel's small worn boots by the door, a braided piece of leather rope that he had made with Joseph Cray's patient instruction and was very proud of. Joseph Cray stayed. He was as much a part of the ranch as anyone on it by the time Samuel was 2, and starting to follow him around with the dogged interest of a small boy who has identified someone as a source of important knowledge. And Joseph bore this with a dignity that was clearly covering up considerable enjoyment. He taught Samuel about horses with the same patient precision that Clarence had always used, and Samuel learned it with a focused attention that was very much his father's. Well, Ferris came and went with the seasons and his particular nature, which seemed to require motion the way some people required stillness. But he always came back to Sweetwater Creek in the end, and Harriet had long since stopped thinking of him as a hired hand and started thinking of him as family, which she told him directly one autumn, and he went red to his ears with a combination of embarrassment and pleasure that was entirely characteristic of him. In the spring of 1882, their daughter was born. They named her Clara, and she was from the first moment a different creature from her brother, where Samuel was his father's child in temperament, deliberate and observant and quiet-natured. Clara was her mother's daughter in every loud and determined way, with a set of opinions about the world that she expressed constantly and vigorously from the first weeks of her life. Clarence held her the way he had held everything on the ranch that was fragile and new, with complete steadiness and absolute care, and she looked up at him with her gray eyes. She had his eyes exactly, and he looked back at her, and whatever he had been before became something slightly different. The way each thing in your life that you love changes the dimensions of what you are. Harriet watched him with Clara and with Samuel on the evenings when the ranch was quiet and the day's work was done, and she felt the particular richness of a life that had been built by her own hands on terms that were entirely her own, and she thought that the woman on the dun mare riding into Caldwell 4 springs ago had been right about the important things, that she was capable of building something real, that she deserved wages that were fair, that she should not compromise herself for less than she was worth, and had been wrong about one significant thing, which was that love was a luxury she could not afford. It was not a luxury. It was the only actual return on investment that had mattered. On a morning in the late spring of 1882, when the wheat was coming up green, and even in the south field, and the expanded east section was showing its first shoots in the dark soil, and the prairie was doing its best impression of a paradise in the early light with the birds and the wind and the creek all contributing their parts, Harriet stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and looked out at it all. And Clarence came in from the early feeding and stood behind her and looked at the same view over her shoulder, and she leaned back against him, and he put his arm around her, Samuel still asleep in the bedroom and Clara making small, emphatic sounds in the cradle that suggested the morning. Had not been long enough in starting. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That the low field is going to need another week before it is ready to work," she said. "I know," he said. "What else?" she considered. The light moved across the fields, changing as it did every morning, never quite the same, always worth watching. The meadowlark that had nested in the south corner of the wheat field for the 3rd year running was already up and saying whatever it had to say with its particular liquid authority. "That I was wrong about what I wanted," she said, "and right about how to go after it." He was quiet for a moment behind her, and she felt him smile, which was something she could feel without seeing because she had learned him that completely. "You were very determined about those terms," he said. "I was right about some of them," she said. "I should have equal partnership in this land, and I should do the work I am capable of, and nobody should underestimate me because of what I am." "Agreed," he said. "I was wrong about the wages only part," she said. "Only took you 6 months to figure that out," he said. "It took you just as long," she said. "It took me about 3 weeks," he said, with the particular quality of honesty he had that was sometimes inconvenient. She turned around and looked at him. He looked back at her with those clear gray eyes and that face she knew as well as she knew the land outside the window, and she thought, 3 weeks, and he had held it for 5 more months without pushing, without pressuring, without doing anything other than being exactly and consistently himself, and she thought that this was perhaps the thing about him that had undone her most completely. "3 weeks," she said. "When you fixed the barn roof in the rain," he said. "I came back from the south fence, and I stood against the wall, and I knew." She remembered the moment, remembered looking down and seeing him there, looking away because it felt private. "Saw you," she said. "I thought you might have," he said. She shook her head, a small motion that meant something between exasperation and tenderness. Clara's sounds from the bedroom had reached a more insistent register. Samuel's boots appeared in the hall doorway, moving toward breakfast with the efficiency of a 4-year-old who had decided his morning had objectives. "I am going to need help with the south planting this week," she said. "I know," he said. "August and Carl are coming Thursday. We will be ready. And the fence on the west line needs attention before we move the cattle. I saw it yesterday," he said. "2 posts need resetting." "I can do the posts," she said. "I know you can," he said, the way he had always known from the first week, and she thought. That was it. That was all of it. That was the whole story. A man who had looked at who she was and seen it clearly and not needed to reduce it. And a woman who had been careful and capable and independent, and had found out that those things were not diminished, but enlarged by the particular love of the right person. Samuel arrived at the kitchen table and announced that he was hungry. Clara made a sound from the bedroom that suggested she was in complete agreement with this position. The morning light came through the windows and fell across the kitchen floor the way it always did, and the meadowlark called from the south field, and the land that was theirs, hers and Clarence's, equally, legally, completely lay green and new and ready under the Kansas sky. Harriet poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to her husband and looked at him across the kitchen of the house that was their home, and she thought about the woman she had been on that March morning in 1878, riding a dun mare northeast with a leather saddlebag and a Winchester and a plan, and she thought, the plan was good. The plan was right about almost everything. But the best part was the part she had not planned for at all. She had told him she planned to work his land for wages only. He had agreed, because he was a man of his word. And then the season had happened and the work had happened, and the daily reality of a person who was exactly themselves had happened, and by the end of it neither of them had been able to maintain their original terms, and that had turned out to be the best thing that had ever happened to either of them. Clara called from the bedroom, with an authority that could not be postponed. Harriet went to get her daughter, and Clarence started the morning fire, and Samuel sat at the table with his serious small face and waited for breakfast. And the ranch outside the windows woke into the full sound of a spring morning on the Kansas plains, and the meadowlark sang, and the wheat rose green from the dark earth, and the creek ran clear over its stones, and the whole wide sky ran its usual miracle from one horizon to the other, and the life they had built between them held.